Hi, I'm Dave Wascher, the owner of Nashville Violins, and joining me is Kevin Rilling. He's luthier here at the shop. And the presentation that we're giving today is how not to break your instrument. It's going to be a discussion of some care and maintenance and some diagnostics of bowed stringed instruments. And a couple of things here to point out right off the bat. We're going to use the word violin a lot because it's violin family instruments. And generally speaking, when we say the word violin, it means, the full range of instruments, the basses and the cellos and even the violas. But lots of times we use the word violin, and for the most part, the terms and discussions and everything that we say applies to all of the instruments of the violin family. So if we say violin, we're not excluding the bigger instruments, and there are a few things that are unique to those bigger instruments. But most of the things are pretty similar, or not exactly. So, any introduction stuff you want to start us off with here? So.
Well, like Dave said, I'm Kevin. If you brought your instrument in to be worked on or anything like that in the last couple of years, chances are I've worked on it at some point. So, hi.
And one of our purposes in this is to give you a little bit of a better idea about your instrument, and then the things that you can do to keep it running properly, and hopefully keep it from coming into the shop when it doesn't need to come into the shop, and also knowing when it is a good idea to bring it. A couple of things first. We probably want to talk a little bit about some of the parts of your instrument. I'm not going to go over a lot of these in a lot of detail. Any of your method books are going to have a page dedicated to all the parts of your instrument. And it would be a good idea to go through those parts, and a lot of you probably have done that with your teachers or either on your own, and learn the basic names for all the parts in the instrument. That comes in really handy if you do have a problem. You don't have to say that thing that does the string holding is something's wrong with it. If you're able to tell us it's the bridge, or it's the pegs, or it's the tailpiece, or it's fine tuner, that does help when you're discussing things, especially on the phone and virtual world where it's harder to see and taste things.
It makes our jobs a little bit easier.
Yeah. So you can go over a lot of that on your own. A lot of the things that people come in when something obvious is wrong with the instrument. So we'll have a broken bridge, or they'll have the neck is broken off, or they'll have a big crack, or something is falling off the instrument on this one here. When something like that happens, then it's emergency, and they know they need to come in. But there's a lot of more subtle things that don't pop up as easy to see. So I want to go over a couple of those. I think you brought in some props for us so people can see it a little bit bigger.
Yeah. So for one thing, so what I brought in here is a bass bridge. This is very big, as you can see. But all the violin family instruments have a bridge that's going to be similar to this, just smaller in scale, most likely. What's kind of interesting about this particular bridge is that if you can imagine it sitting on a bass here, if the fingerboard was over here and then the tailpiece was over here, it would be sitting like this. If you can see it from there, it's not perfectly straight, is it? It's actually kind of bending, kind of like this, bending towards my right. So what that means is this bridge has started to warp a little bit. And all that tension, when all the strings are tuned up, pushing down the bridge, if it's not lined up just right, then it can start over time to warp like this. So if you take a look at your bridge on your instrument, look at it from the side, just like we're doing here. And it should be looking like it's leaning back just a teeny tiny bit, but mostly straight up and down on the back. If you see that it's starting to curve forward or curve backward a whole lot, that's a good time to probably bring it into a luthier. It's probably a good time to get that bridge replaced. Warps, bass bridge.
Knowing when to take it into a luthier is really good. The book I was talking about here, My Violin Needs Help, is a really good book. This kind of goes over some of the same things that we're covering here, and some things in a little more detail. But I really like one of the phrases that she uses really often in this book. Take it to a luthier. So there are certain things that at some point you want to do that. It's nice to know when necessary. So I've got a violin here, so you can kind of see on this. And there's a couple different ways that you can check this, and it can be difficult for the player to see what angle really that bridge should be at. And showing it kind of backwards of what you were just doing here. But you can kind of see this is a flatter angle, and this angle that we have here is a sharper angle. So to me, it's like, you ever been in a windstorm and the wind is blowing at you and you have to kind of lean into the wind to feel like this, otherwise it's trying to push you over sideways. And so that's what happens with this. That bridge is kind of getting pushed more this direction. And so the bridge has to kind of lean that way to compensate for that. On most instruments, it ends up being that this side of the bridge towards the tailpiece is a 90-degree angle to the top. And when I view the top, I always look at this body line rather than the top part of it, which is curved, get that 90-degree angle. But it should lean a little bit towards the tailpiece, and that side should appear to be flat. Right, it shouldn't have a curve going this direction, a curve going the other. Doing that. A couple other things that are really common, and some people think these are really bad, is when you end up with an open seam on your instrument. And lots of times people don't notice that because they're dark. It's kind of hard to see, but they'll notice that their instrument sounds different. It just doesn't sound like it used to sound. And one of the reasons for that will be because one of these seams has popped open, and that's actually a good thing. The type of glues that we use are made to come apart, so when the seam pops open, it's relieving that stress as the wood shrinks, especially in older instruments. They start shrinking, and if that doesn't pop open, then they'll end up getting a crack in the top, and that's a lot more serious to repair. So things like these seams are actually made to come apart and come open for those instruments. Need that. Of course, if that doesn't happen, or if your instrument is dropped or something, you can end up getting a crack. That's a serious thing to do. The neck will sometimes break on an instrument, or the fingerboard will come loose on it. Those are things to watch out for.
Yeah. One way, so just like Dave was saying, the glue that we use on our instruments, it's made so that we can get in there and open up the instrument if we need to, for whatever reason. But something he just mentioned that you might come across is your fingerboard coming loose. That's of course this part here, and it's not always immediately noticeable when it's come loose, especially when it's still strung up and under tension and everything. It can look like everything is normal. So one way that you can gently check to see if your fingerboard is loose is you're holding your instrument like this. Imagine this is strung up and there's a bridge and everything. You can very gently pull on this end here of your fingerboard, and just look at the line here along the neck where the fingerboard meets the neck, just to see if there's any wiggle there, and if there's any gaps as you gently move it around, then your fingerboard's loose. One indicator that your fingerboard might be loose is that your action starts to feel a little bit different.
Yeah,
from how it
strings will be higher up the fingerboard, it'll be harder to press, and the instrument will have a different feel to it.
Yeah.
That fingerboard piece is very important because this little piece of maple here isn't very strong, but the black piece that's made out of ebony is very strong, and it resists bending. But when that comes loose, then the little piece of maple out of it starts bending, and that's dangerous. That can break the whole neck part off of here if it's off.
Yeah, all that tension gets transferred to just this little piece right here, so that's never good.
It'll kind of bend up like this, and this will drop down, and the action will seem like it's way high. When you get to that point, it's dangerous. You can end up breaking things. So take it to a luthier. A couple other things that I do when I'm inspecting an instrument. That's one of the first things I do when someone hands me an instrument. If it's kind of close in tune, I always want to tune them right up. I don't know why it is so important. Right in tune, I just kind of do that out of habit. And then that inspection to go around and looking for the open seams and all of these. Looking at the action as well to see how high the strings are off. I'm inspecting the peg area to make sure I don't have any little cracks in this peg area. Especially on the tiniest one here, it's easy to get a little crack. Forcing your pegs all the time. After I finish with this area, checking the fingerboard we just talked about, I'll usually come down and look at this part of the instrument. So I'm looking to make sure that the tailpiece looks good. It's not touching the chin rest. Nothing is loose down here. I don't see anything weird going on. The end pin looks straight. I don't see any gaps or any little, it's pulling up on me here. Then I'll look over the top of the instrument, make sure I don't have any little wing cracks. These little cracks right here are really common. People grab their instruments here, they push too hard in those areas. It's easy to get a little crack going in there. We talked about the bridge, looking at the bridge, and then right below that, you've got this little sound post that's in there. It's hard to see. I think you brought something to kind of show us a little bit easier, that sound post there.
Yeah, so not all players know about this, but there's a little piece of wood that stands up on the inside of your instrument. That little piece of wood is actually really, really important. And so if you look inside of your F holes here, and sometimes it can help to have a little flashlight or something, you should see all it is a little piece of wood standing up inside right about here, right about where I'm putting it on the top of the violin. One thing that can happen if you haven't touched your instrument for a long time, or if there's been a sudden change in temperature or humidity, is occasionally that sound post can fall over on the inside of your instrument. So if you ever pick up your instrument and you can hear this, hear something rolling around on the inside, take a look at your F holes and see, is my sound post still standing up? If it's not, that's a good time to go to your pegs and take some of that tension off of the instrument. You don't want to leave your instrument tuned up to pitch without that sound post standing up, because that can actually hurt or damage your instrument. So that little piece of wood is actually really, really important.
Very important. Yeah. And Kevin brings up a good point. If you ever do have something serious wrong with your instrument, looks like your neck's pulling off, or you have the fingerboard pulling off, or you have a crack or the sound post rolling around, the safest thing to do for your instrument is get that tension off of it so things don't get worse, and loosening those strings. If you do loosen the strings, there's a good chance that your bridge is going to fall off. Sometimes the whole thing, it'll look like this. People always get scared when they see an instrument like this, because we're used to seeing one with all the parts on it. So when you see one that looks naked like that, they're like, oh, it's all broken. We're used to seeing that all the time. Take them apart and work on them. So, if you do have parts that fall off, or even if your sound post falls over, that's fine. You're on your way to come see us anyway, and we'll fix whatever the crack is or whatever the problem is. And that sound post is not a big deal when you have the right parts and you've done this a million times. So those are just some of the things that we look at when we're going through and inspecting an instrument right off the bat. Probably the most important thing for you guys would be to try not to have to bring it in here, and the best thing for that is to make sure you take care of your instrument to begin with, so that it's not in a situation where it can get dropped or crushed or something that would damage the instrument. So talk about a few things that are really important to keep your instrument out of the shop. So some of the instrument care. And one of my favorite phrases that I like to tell everybody, because I think it sticks with them pretty well, and hopefully it works for you guys as well, is never leave your instrument any place that you wouldn't be comfortable sleeping. And so you're not going to want to sleep someplace that's too cold or too hot, or out in the car, or out in the parking lot, in some places too wet. So if your instrument, they always say, if your instrument's not comfortable, you wouldn't be either. So that's one of the big things. Heat and cold and humidity are all really dangerous for an instrument. So keeping consistent temperature and environment for your instrument is really important. One of the safest things then for your instrument is to keep it inside of your case. That helps to make it so that when you do have changes in temperature and humidity, like when you take your instrument to your lessons, it's going to change gradually inside of that case, more so than if you were just walking around with the instrument outside, getting rained on and sun and sleet and all that kind of stuff. So being inside the case will let that change happen a lot more slowly, which is healthier for your instrument. You can also control the things like the humidity inside the case a lot easier. So a good case is super important, especially if you have a really nice instrument. It's a good investment. It can do more to protect your instrument than just about anything else that you can do. That's what they're built for. And the newer modern cases are built even better than the ones were just 20 years ago. One of the things that you'll see in pretty much every case that's made now for better quality instruments is what they call a suspension case. And just to kind of describe that, so on your violin, you have a block here where your neck goes. You have a block down here where all this other stuff is hooked in. And so those are two very solid points in your instrument. So you can put as much pressure on these 2 points as you want. You won't damage your instrument. On most of your better cases, they're called a suspension case. They have a piece here inside the case and a piece here that both of those blocks will rest on in your instrument. You won't have any pressure here where the sound post is and the back part of your instrument. And more importantly, you won't have anything on the neck area hitting on the case. And so it's just floating on those 2 blocks. It's a very safe way to transport your instrument. On a lot of your older cases, it's right here resting where the back and the sound post and all the way out here where the neck is. And so in an older case like that, if you ever drop the case, you trip or it falls down the stairs, you put a lot of pressure on this neck area and you break those necks off. So especially for older instruments, it's important to have that kind of suspension case. What are some of the other things that you encounter with people not using their cases properly?
Well, I do just want to show you all something, just kind of to stress the importance of having a nice case. This is approximately half of a cello that was dropped, I think, from a pretty significant height onto a hard surface. You can see how that ended up. So having a good, strong, sturdy case whenever you're transporting your instrument, really, really important, right? For instruments of all sizes, basses, cellos included. And just another thing too, even just from a security standpoint too, bring your case inside with you. We've had a couple of customers over the years come in and say, unfortunately, they had their instrument taken from out of their car, even when they went inside a store for just a few minutes or something like that. So even if you're just having to run errands or something and you happen to have your instrument with you, don't leave it in your car.
Yeah,
bring it with you. Always better to be safe.
Only takes a second to bring it with you, and it only takes a second for someone to smash out a window. That's always really sad.
So another one of the things that we do here, in addition to instrument repair, we'll also take care of a lot of case repairs as well. So a lot of times with just general wear and tear on your case, you might notice your zippers stop working, or you might have a latch that no longer lines up properly or something like that. Those are really important things to get fixed too, because you would hate to package up your instrument, think that you've got it all latched up and closed everything, pick it up, and then everything just falls out onto the floor. Seen that happen a couple of times. It's never pretty. So if anything with the case itself is defective or not working properly anymore, then bring that into a luthier as well. We can most likely repair.
A lot of the student cases don't have a lot of room for storage in there, and it's really important with your case that you only put what fits into the case into the case. You see a lot of times that people have a shoulder rest, and they'll take the shoulder rest off the instrument, which if you play violin or viola, you have to take the shoulder rest off. It doesn't fit in the case with that underneath there. If you leave that underneath there, it pushes the instrument up. The bridge is going to hit on the top of the instrument. It's likely to put a lot of pressure, give you a sound post crack. Not a good thing to have. That's a kiss of death on most instruments. It's expensive to repair that. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, there's a little cutout right here. I can put my shoulder rest right here on top of the instrument." They close the case, and there's not enough of a cutout. The bows come down, and it pushes right here and gives you a nice crack right here on the top of the instrument. Sometimes they'll try to put it around the peg box. I mentioned earlier that with the floating case where you have no pressure anywhere around this neck, that's very important. If you cram a shoulder rest in there, then it's hitting on the pegs, which is going to knock your instrument out of tune, and you're also usually pushing the instrument up. So again, it defeats that purpose of the suspension. And you drop that case or you press down on something, and you can break things real easy. So if there isn't a spot where you put the shoulder rest not in with the instrument, a lot of them have an extra pocket over here or one on the side where you can put it where it's not in contact with the instrument, and that's good. See a lot of people that try to fold their music book and stick it underneath the instrument. Again, that pushes it up, and you're going to run where there's not room. You use a mute. You can't leave that mute on top of the bridge. It's got to move over because those. If you look at the top of your case, you can probably see the imprint from the rosin. It's that close that just a little bit jiggling around, and that touches the top of the case. There's not enough clearance for anything in the case that doesn't have a spot. If you need that extra storage, then get you an oblong case that has an outside pocket for the music and a place for the shoulder rest and a place for however many bows you want to put in.
Basically, you don't want to be putting any additional pressure onto the instrument than it's already got, right, with all the tension of the strings.
A lot of pressure. When you're not playing the instrument, the safest place for it is going to be in the case. The case is there to protect the instrument, so if you do trip over it in the middle of the night, it's going to take the impact and not your instrument. You don't want to leave your instrument sitting on the couch or on your bed. It might seem like a good idea. You're practicing and you're going to take a little 5-minute break and you leave it laying on the bed or on the couch or whatever. Kind of forget about it because something's on TV, and by the time it gets dark and you go flopping in there and crash down on it, yeah, it doesn't like that.
Or if you're like me and you have a cat and she likes to get up on the bed and knock stuff off, then that can be disastrous for you too.
Pets, little kids. There are some ways that you can leave your instrument out. It's nice to have your instrument out where it's accessible. We've got violins hung up behind us, you can see in the camera. If you have a hanger that's on the wall, pets can't get to that, little kids, that works great. If you have a specific instrument stand where you can put that safely on a table, those hold the instrument well. Particularly for basses and cellos, it's nice. They're hard to get out of those.
That can be cumbersome, yeah.
You want to give us talk about some bows here?
Sure.
So you've got a nice looking bow there.
So I grabbed a bow just to show you a few things to do and not to do with it. For one thing, you don't want to tap things with it. That's of course going to hurt either the tip of it or the stick itself. You know, bows are just meant to be bowed with, right? Don't whack each other with it. Let's see. Of course, you probably all already know this, but it's good to go over this. Make sure you're not touching the bow hairs with your fingers, right? You don't want to get any dirt or oils from your hands onto those bow hairs because then they won't hold rosin as effectively, and then it won't work as well.
I see that a lot in the summertime. People that wear shorts, touch your skin when you lay it on your lap, and then sometimes girls will play with their hair. They'll put a lot of oils on there.
Yeah.
Don't ever touch the hair.
Mm-hmm. It's good practice too, just in general, before you start practicing, just to go ahead and wash your hands, especially in this day and age. But just good practice to, as soon as right before you start playing, just make sure your hands are clean before you start touching your instrument. Occasionally, so with horsehair, as you use it over and over again and practice for many hours at a time, you'll notice that some hairs will break and start to come loose. In fact, I've got a few loose hairs down here. So one thing you don't want to do when you see one little strand of hair come off is don't yank it and just pull on it. That can actually pull out some of the smaller parts that are in here or up here inside the end of the bow. It's better to get like some nail clippers or some very fine scissors and just snip that off instead of yanking on it.
Every player should have a set of nail clippers in their case anyway, because you don't want to let your fingernails get long. That will tear up your strings. So if you keep your fingernails shorter where they're not hitting on the strings when you play, that helps. There's a lot of little parts in the bow. There's a little tiny piece of wood up here that holds the hair in. There's a couple little parts down there that hold the hair and spread the hair out down there on that end. Tapping it can make that little plug come out. We have a lot of people that they'll knock that little plug out and then the hair all comes out. But the way that it's put in here, it's you comb it all straight and you tie a wrap around. It's kind of like a little ponytail, and you start pulling on the hair, and eventually you get a little bit of a hole, and it gets all the way back to where that knot is, and they'll come right out of that knot if you pull them out that way.
Yeah.
Bows can be rehaired. You don't want to have to do that if it doesn't need that. So one thing that sometimes people try to do when an instrument gets really dirty, or the bow, we were talking about touching the bow hairs, you don't ever want to try to clean the hair. Sometimes people say, yeah, you can use some insert product that's not safe to be around your instrument, and they'll try to clean the hair, but anything that'll take the rosin and the oil and the gunk off of the hair would also take that off of the stick.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those solvents are very dangerous around a violin. Sometimes people say, you can clean your alcohol on your strings or something. You get one tiny, tiny little drop of alcohol on a nice violin, and it'll just run right down. And as quick as you can try to wipe it off, it's taking the finish with it. It's very sad. It looks like the violin's crying. And it is not an easy fix. Going through and doing finish work on the violin is time consuming.
It's very time consuming
To make that look. So that correlates to expensive. So you don't want to have to do that if you don't want to. Most of the time, the safest thing to do is just to use a clean cloth. On some instruments, even using something that has no chemicals or anything, if something is innocent as water, on some instruments is enough to actually affect the finish. So I'm hesitant to recommend using a cleaner or a polish even on an instrument until you've talked to somebody, talk to a luthier, and know for sure. We can test our cleaners in an area that doesn't show. Normally underneath the chin rest it comes off, so you're not going to be able to see if you do have fragile finish on it. The safest thing to do is wipe it down with a clean cloth, handkerchief, part of a t-shirt. Those little microfiber cloths work great. You can use those on your strings. You can use them, fingers touch down here. You can wipe down the instrument. You want to avoid putting a lot of pressure around where the F-holes are on your instrument. But you can keep that rosin off. If you wipe that down every time you're done playing, it won't build up. If you leave the rosin on there because it looks cool or because you're too lazy to do it after you're done playing, that builds up. It'll actually eat into the finish. And then, especially in the summertime when the instruments get warm, or that'll want to melt and eat right into the finish. And sometimes we can't get that off without endangering the finish on the instrument. So wiping that off with a cloth when you're done playing, wiping the neck down, and then washing that cloth on a regular basis. One of the best things you can do to keep your instrument clean, keep it looking nice, keeping your strings working well. Some strings are expensive, and if you keep them clean, they'll last a lot longer.
occasionally we'll get like fiddlers or folks like that come in and they ask us not to clean off all that old caked on rosin. They're going for more of an antiqued, worn in kind of look, which is always interesting. So usually it's better to go ahead and clean that stuff off. But
that makes it hard to work on because you're trying to work around that and we're having to cut bridges and do things and not touch certain areas.
True. And another thing too, I know I mentioned washing your hands before you practice or work with your bow or anything. A lot of us nowadays are using a lot of hand sanitizer, and a lot of those are alcohol based. So if you are sanitizing your hands before you start playing, just make absolutely sure that your hands are totally dry before handling your instrument. Because again, even if just a little bit of that alcohol gets onto the varnish or the stick of the bow, that can be disastrous. your instrument.
Well, and sweat is corrosive to the strings. So if you sweat a lot, some people are real hard on their strings. You might need to try a couple different brands of strings to find something that doesn't react with the acids, things in your sweat if you sweat a lot. And even water can hurt on it. You know, if you ever do let your instrument get wet, you want to make sure you wash that off right away. Wipe that down, make sure it's dry. We've had people bring in instruments that have gotten wet and they've let that water sit on there and it discolors the finish, and it's actually underneath the finish, so it's not something that's easy to touch up.
Yeah. Water damage on a wood instrument is not pretty.
Not fun. Yeah.
Not
fun. So general care is super important. The more that you take care of your instrument, you're going to keep it out from us. There's a few maintenance things that you need to do. Similar to what you do on your car, you have to do things every so often on your car, because if you don't, then it comes back to bite you. And we love seeing your instruments. When we have someone bring an instrument to us, we can look at it and immediately tell what it is that the instrument needs, where a buzz is coming from and why it's not doing what it used to do. And we had a customer today. I had one in yesterday. They were just amazed that we were able to say, wow, he's so fast. When you do this a whole lot, we can change strings quickly. We can quickly see when things aren't right. So one of the best things that you can do for your instrument is once in a while bring it in so that an expert can look at your instrument and make sure that there's not something that you missed. People tend to see the real obvious things and not the more subtle things.
Yeah, some of those just even annual kind of checkups include getting your strings changed out. Most string manufacturers recommend between 6 months to a year changing out your strings, depending on what kind of strings they are and how often you're practicing and how hard you're playing and that kind of thing. I think most bows need to be rehaired about once a year. Okay.
Yeah, it's recommended to do them once a year if you're a regular player. Most students go longer than that. When it gets to be about 2 years, what happens is there's little microscopic things in there that help to hold the hair and help the rosin in there. And when you start wearing some of that smooth, it doesn't hold the rosin anymore, and so it'll work fine on the ends that you don't play, but in the middle where you play the most, it just doesn't grab like it used to. And the same thing with strings. They degrade slowly over time. It's not now they work, now they don't. So people think that they don't have to change it out until they break one. It's obvious if it's broken, now you have to change it. But they're constantly changing, and a lot of things happen with the strings. Strings are really amazing. When a string vibrates, you get the full vibration of the string, which is the pitch that you're playing. So like you have A, and so you have that vibration that's going on with an A. And on a violin and a viola, it's 440 times a second that's going around. But in addition to that full vibration that's going on, it also vibrates in halves and thirds and fourths and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that really makes an instrument sound the best and have that fullest sound is to have all those overtones with it. When your strings get old, what happens is you're down here on this end playing, wearing that fan and getting oils in there. The string's constantly stretching, which makes thin spots. Down here near the bridge where you're bowing it all the time, you're getting rosin built up. If you don't wipe that down, then you've got thicker strings here, some thin sections, some cruddy sections here. And so instead of getting that full vibration, you get kind of a jumbled mess. It's kind of like when you have a big jump rope and you have one person on one side and one on the other. When you're both going evenly, you get a nice big circle going, and people can jump rope on that. But if one goes faster than the other, you get this jumbled mess. And that's what happens with your strings when they get old. And someone that plays a lot knows what to listen for. It doesn't sound right. It's not as full as it used to be. Sometimes when they're playing, they'll tune it with the tuner, it'll be right on, but it just doesn't sound like it's in tune. It just doesn't sound right anymore. And those are all indications that your strings are old. And it's not always things that you can see. There's many layers in these strings that you can't always see all the different things going on inside. Sometimes you can. You can look and see that the wrapping is coming loose. And you can feel. Sometimes you can feel it moving, and sometimes it'll even buzz because it's so bad.
Yeah, the string life is a really gradual process of changing from what it was when it was new to being very used and worn in. A lot of times when like a teacher recommends that a student come into the shop and get their strings changed out, as soon as we bring the instrument out with those new strings on, and even just plucking one of the strings, they can immediately tell, oh, that sounds way better. If those old strings have been on there for a really long time. Even if they hadn't noticed a change before, like, oh, this is just how my instrument sounds, with those new strings on, they can just tell, oh, yeah, that's how it's supposed to sound.
And if you can tell a change when you put new strings on, then you've waited too long, because then your instrument is you've really been suffering with bad tone. Too long. The bridge, we mentioned how important the bridge is. It's kind of the heart of the instrument. It's all the sound comes through this bridge. This is what gets all the sound from your strings vibrating into the rest of the instrument. It's super important. Couple things that you can look for. When you look at your instruments, it should be symmetrical. So it should look like the bridge is centered between this side and this side of your instrument here. It shouldn't look like it's off to one side. When you sight down the fingerboard, you shouldn't see strings closer on one side than you do on the other. That's an indication that the bridge is shifted over sideways. That happens sometimes, especially in the wintertime, when you have the pegs will pop out with the changes in temperature. And because there's no tension on one side, the bridge will shift a little bit, and you may not notice, and you tighten it up. So you look at that. This may be, I don't think you can see it in the video here because we're too far away, but you've got little notches inside the up holes, and you've got one right here on this side and a corresponding one on the other side. The bridge is generally, on most instruments, if you just drew an imaginary line between those 2 points, that should go right through the middle of the bridge. So if you've got a notch here and the bridge is way up here, then it's not in the right spot. Too far down there. So that placement is real important in that side to side. We already talked a little bit about the angle that it is here. The bridge is also responsible for how high the strings are off the fingerboard. If that bridge is too high or too low, it can cause buzzing or it can make the instrument difficult to play. This curve is very important. If it's flat, if you have a hard time playing on one string because there's a flat spot on the bridge, that can make it extremely frustrating for people. Or if it's too low to where it's going to buzz on the fingerboard, especially if you use finger tapes on there that stick up, that bridge has to be high enough to clear those finger tapes. So that bridge is super important. There's so many things. And then, the thinning and the cutting and the tuning and everything. Not something you can do yourself, but you can certainly keep an eye to make sure it hasn't moved. We can make adjustments to the position and straighten everything out.
Yeah, setup goes a long way in how nice your instrument sounds, but also just how well it plays too. How easy it is.
Want me to keep going? Sure. I talked a little bit about humidity. Humidity does a lot of things for your instruments, and we're coming up to winter right now. When you watch this video later, it may be a different time of year. Your instrument's going to respond differently if it's humid than it does if it's dry. Some people, they'll notice a big change in the sound of the instrument. Sometimes the instrument itself will adjust to those, and you may notice that the angles of things change and the action will change. And sometimes people have a summer bridge and a winter bridge, especially on bigger instruments, violas and cellos. They might have different bridges that they use different times of year. One of the best investments you can make, especially if you have an old instrument, is some kind of humidifier that goes in the case to help keep that humidity more consistent. Keeping it in the case in the wintertime is helpful. Making sure that you don't have a place that you store your instrument where you've got forced air blowing on it. That can dry them out really quickly in the wintertime. We have instruments out here. We don't have any air blowing directly on any of them. And we have a whole house humidifier that keeps the entire shop, our humidity up. It feels pretty humid in here right now, and here we're going into winter, it's been dry. So we're able to keep that humidity where it should be so your instrument is healthy. There's a number of devices to help humidify your instrument and also to track that as well. We have those here in the shop. One of my least favorite are the little tubes that go inside. They work well, but you have to maintain those every day. They dry out so quickly, and it's also dangerous because you can put a lot of moisture, and sometimes you can see water droplets and water stains where people don't dry those completely when they put them inside. So a lot of the newer ones now fit inside the case and gradually let moisture go in, and sometimes even take the moisture out different times of the year. And humidity can affect that, and it also makes a big impact on the pegs. You know, what happens when they dry out? This time of year, we're going into the dry season. What do people complain about this time?
A lot of times you'll notice your pegs will pop out. They become loose.
Sometimes they'll shoot across the room.
Sometimes they'll fly across it. That's never fun because then you have to go searching for your pegs.
Yeah. So the reason why that happens, you should have on most nicer instruments, all the black pieces are actually ebony, which is very dense, very hard. It doesn't change much throughout the year. On some of the less expensive instruments, it'll be some other type of wood that's painted. Those are very susceptible to changes in temperature and humidity. But the wood around this, is on all violins, you've got maple for your neck, for your sides, for your back. You've got spruce for the top, which is even softer. But even maple is very soft, one of the softest hardwoods that you can get. And as the temperature and the humidity changes, that wood is going to expand and contract. And as it does that, it's going to make that hole the peg goes into bigger and smaller. And when it dries out, it's going to open up. Things dry out, opens up, and that peg can just spin right out. It's a good idea. A lot of students never do this because they never tune with these pegs. They always use the fine tuners down here. It's a good idea every so often to go through and loosen those pegs and work them back up again. If you're a professional player, you're constantly tuning them. Not. And a couple of tricks here. You'll never break a string going flat. So you can always loosen a string and you're not going to damage the string. And so the first thing you should do is loosen that string up, and you can gradually bring it up to pitch. And this is not an easy thing for beginners to do, and it's probably something that you'll need help with. We're happy to show people that you're watching here right now. But I like to hold on to the instrument fairly close to the scroll and the pegs here, and trace to make sure I've got the right peg, and pick it so I know what I'm listening for. Make sure I've got the right peg. You hear that little pop when it first goes. And so if the peg hasn't been turned a lot, it'll kind of pop that first time. And then it should, this works perfectly. And then it just slides right up where it's supposed to go. Just a slight amount of pressure as I tune up, just kind of push and hold that in is all that you really need. You shouldn't ever need to cram your peg to get it to hold. And if you're having to cram on that peg to get that to hold, then there's something wrong. The peg doesn't match the hold. All those tapers need to be just right. There's treatments that you can use to help hold those in. There's one product that I do not like, that I do not recommend, and at least you hear a lot of people that recommend what are called peg drops. And so it's a little liquid thing that has a little dropper. And the idea is that you can just drop this liquid and it kind of goes in there, and it's supposed to help hold the peg in. And it does work for a while. What ends up happening, because it's a liquid, it adds moisture in, it swells the wood. And so it'll swell it, it'll hold that peg in, but as soon as it dries out,
You got the same
it
problem.
wants to pop out again. And it can cause a lot of problems down the road and then because it's got some sticky stuff in there too, it ends up making it to where you can't get them to work smoothly like that either.
If you notice your pegs are popping out, or they're slipping, or they're really hard to turn, if you are comfortable tuning with the pegs, then that's always a good time to bring it into a luthier, because we've got some compounds, we've got some materials that we can put on the pegs that will either make them turn a little bit smoother or keep them from slipping as much. There is some
Yes, the pegs go pop, 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 pop. When you're trying to tune them, that's not a good thing. It should turn smoothly and sound nice like that one did. I didn't even test that one. I was just hoping it would sound good. We went through our shop, so it was in good shape. We had talked, if your instrument suddenly sounds different, that's a good indication that something has changed in the instrument. Bring it to a luthier. If you find anything major that's wrong with your instrument, bring it in a luthier. You don't want to try to fix it yourself. We have a lot of people that, and it's nice. You should know how to change your strings and general things. You should know how to tune your own instrument. But you don't want to try to fix an open seam or a crack. The first rule for anything, doctors even use this, and we certainly use it here in the shop, is do no harm. Almost everything that we do here in the shop is completely reversible. The instruments are made to come apart. The type of glues we talked about, how easy it is to take, you know what you're doing, to get the glue joints to come loose. They're made to do that. We can take the tops off to fix them if we need to. The type of glues that we use are made so that we can take the instrument apart. So everything is reversible. They're made to hold, but let loose if we need them to do that in order for us to fix things. The violins have been around for over 300 years.
Yeah.
And there are instruments that are that old that are still playable and still worth millions of dollars. Stradivarius, or millions of dollars. Yeah. Because people were able to go in there and properly repair things. If you use the wrong kind of glues, if you try to glue something and you don't get the crack lined up good, trying to go back and fix it after that is sometimes impossible.
Yeah.
To make it look good again, and then our glues won't stick to the wrong glues when you use those, and then you can't get things to hold right again. That's going to cost you a lot more money.
One of the worst things to see when a customer brings in an instrument for a repair is either they or someone else was maybe a little bit too ambitious of a do-it-yourselfer, and they tried to glue an open seam or glue a crack on their own, and they didn't know what type of glue to use. So they just used, your generic wood glue that you can find at whatever hardware stores, and that's never a good sign, because that will always make our job harder if it's not the exact right type of glue.
We've got to get all that old glue out, or our glue won't stick properly. And to top it off, they usually don't have the right tools to clamp it properly. Yeah. So there's still a gap there, and so that doesn't go together messes with the sound. The glues that we use are very hard and brittle, and so they actually help with the sound. A lot of the other glues, they stay soft and they dampen the sound of the instrument. That causes a lot of problems. If you generally do want to learn how to do repairs and do that properly, there are schools for that. There are books that you can read. There are a lot of specialized tools. A lot of the tools, you can buy your tools. A lot of the tools that I use I either made myself, or they've been passed down to me by other makers and other luthiers that have passed those on to me. I've got a lot of old tools. I love old tools, but they're expensive. And they're especially, a lot of them are just one use, one thing. That's what they're for. Setting a sound post is you have to have them bent just right and sharpened just right, and you have to know how to use them so you don't damage the instrument when you're doing that.
Just that one thing, and that's it.
One little thing, and you do something wrong. So there are schools that you can go to, violin making schools and repair schools that you can go to as well. I think we're coming up pretty close on the time that we need to switch over and let people ask questions. I know we didn't cover everything. There are a couple of reference books I was going to mention. This is one book written by Henry Strobel that he's written a bunch of different books, and he's got books on making and a couple ones on repairs. This one is called Useful Measurements for Violin Makers. This is a nice book, and we reference this fairly often. Oh, yeah. Because it's got all the measurements that we use for how high you make your action at the bridge and the nut, and how you space things and how thick things should be. It's got a lot of useful things in there. that cover a lot of, if you are someone that really wants to know the specifics and how exactly thick should the feet of my bridge be. He covers everything in here. It's a pretty well-written book. And then Corinthia Klein just published this. This is a great book. We've got these in the shop. They're $15, and it's a good book that kind of covers a lot of the basic things. These were written, a guide for players and teachers, and so it covers a lot of things that sometimes they see in the public schools, which is a little bit different than what public schools are. Little different than you see maybe in an individual basis. It covers a lot of things in here. It's a well-written book. It's called My Violin Needs Help, and we have those in the shop. Questions, you can go to our website, nashvilleviolins.com, and we've got our contacts on there, so you can give us a call, you can shoot us a text, you can send us an email, you can make an appointment, come on in. We'll spend all the time that we need to explain things to you and go over if you have any questions at all. We love doing this, and it helps players. I know how much they appreciate it because they tell us how much they appreciate having us do that, and how quickly we can fix things, buzzes and wolf notes. We didn't go over any of those today. That they can be really frustrating for someone that doesn't know the things to look for. Changing strings and doing all the other things that we do when we do that. That's why we're here.
Yep.
So, again, thanks for tuning in.